Right, g'day everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Coming at you from the studio. Not quite, it's just super hot outside, so I thought I'd just record it inside today. The topic of this video is going to be something around the New World Order and the lack of virtue in society. But really what I want to talk about is this corruption of virtue as a thing that we have seen sort of very recently in our modern society, but it's happened at other times, which is what I'm going to talk about today. But so in this video, I want to examine virtue and what the end of virtue has always been traditionally. So we'll start off with Aristotle's virtue ethics. So obviously Aristotle wrote about 500 years before Christ, and Plato as well. So and how we're speaking about them is that these guys did not have the light of revelation to inform what they thought was good and bad. But for some reason, they arrived at this, which I'm about to share. So Aristotle's virtue ethics, he basically said the end of man, or a man who truly flourishes, who has that eudaimonia, which they had in the Greek, which is the truest or the highest flourishing of an individual, which is not synonymous to happiness or joy. Those two words are not what eudaimonia means. Eudaimonia means flourishing. So flourishing is basically the human soul, the human character, man taking his greatest expression or living as he was meant to. That's what flourishing means. That's not necessarily the same as joy or happiness. They're not made to match up all the time. This is an individual thing here that Aristotle and Plato identified as the highest good. So what made a man virtuous? Well, let's go back a bit. What is virtue? Virtue is the habitual disposition towards the good. So what does that mean? It means that we have our characters, that we have our inclinations of ourselves as persons, and someone who's truly virtuous is someone who's inclined to do the good thing, to do the right thing, often or all the time. So that is what a virtuous man is, and obviously the end of virtue is the highest good. So whenever someone performs virtuous actions, they must have that good end. So for example, when someone shares you some food, it's a virtuous act because their virtue that they're acting in or acting towards is the virtue of charity, which is obviously not looking out for yourself, but looking out for others. So when someone does a courageous act, the merit in that is that they acted courageously, or they did the thing that was difficult or the thing that they had to pursue and chase despite their fear or despite difficulties that they faced. They were able to overcome that. So that act was courageous. Now, someone who's consistently courageous or charitable becomes virtuous or is virtuous. That's someone that we can call virtuous. So Aristotle and Plato, they both identified virtue as this highest good. And as I said in the beginning of the video, we can take courage. That's a great example. Standing up for the truth or standing up for what is right, more often than not, is not going to be the action that produces happiness or joy for us. In fact, it's often going to produce suffering. So that is a key point that Aristotle and Plato identified already early on without even having Christ or the cross, is that they said there is a highest good, there is a natural end to our lives, we must aim to be virtuous. And that was what they talked about. That was what they talked about that good politicians should be, or good politicians should have and possess. They should be men of virtue. They should be men of high character. And let's move to Stoicism now, because I think this gives us quite a clear example of what I'm trying to address here, and it serves as a really good contrast to the modern world. So obviously Stoicism has kind of had this big upheaval, probably not so much now, but definitely sort of about 5 to 10 years ago, like pop philosophy or whatever you can call it that. But the Stoics have been around forever. So the most famous Stoic was Marcus Aurelius, who was actually 70 years after Christ. But they began a wee bit earlier than that. But basically, they were a group of philosophers, or it's a philosophy that can be characterized as virtue above all. Now, people have this idea of Stoicism being this thing where you deny your emotions and it's like pure grind set. And that's not necessarily wrong. There is a bit of nuance to it, but I think what Stoicism contributed, which is a line that always sticks with me, is this, that virtue is its own reward. So for Marcus Aurelius, he was emperor of the Roman Empire. He could have had all the pleasures in the world. He literally owned like 20% of the known land at the time. So ridiculously rich. He could have had a different woman every night. He could have been drunk for 20 years straight. But he was a man of virtue. And that's very strange for someone in that kind of position. But what he wrote in his meditations was that virtue should be its own reward. And obviously he had come to a point where he had realized that none of these worldly goods or satisfactions or indulgences really contribute to my soul. They're not goods in themselves. Like, they're just these pleasures that are here on earth. And he basically said that the truly good man, or the truly noble man, or the truly virtuous man, he is happy purely by knowing that he acted virtuously. So the reward of virtue is not the good that it produces for myself, or the good that it produces for society, or the good that anything happens, that nothing good might happen, but the fact that I acted virtuously and that I did the right thing should be enough of a consolation to me, or that's enough for the truly moral man. So that was what they lived by. It was virtue above all, that none of these worldly things mattered. What good is it having pleasures available to me, or me indulging in pleasures, if I'm not actually virtuous? Because the pleasures are at such a lower level, like that's the level of animals. The Stoics wanted to live at the level of philosophers, or a rational man who truly lived by virtue and for virtue. So, and we can see this in the other Roman philosophers and sort of a lot of their ethos, especially sort of in the early Republic of Rome. But there was this austerity about living and about being a man and about being a Roman citizen that was super focused on virtue. And we see this in the Greeks as well, in Greek democracy, like how people had to live and cultivate themselves for the good of the polis, which was the Greek city-state. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that all throughout the ancient world, they were people who would not have technically had a religion, or obviously they were pagans, they worshipped some gods, but that wasn't even part of the reason why they acted this way. It was purely natural virtue. It was this almost instinctual or intuitive recognition of acting well and acting rightly that should be put above all things. And now let's go into Christianity, because that's what happens next. So Christianity is very similar, but I guess there's some extra things added, like, well, now we're acting sort of in order to please God, or in order to try and get to heaven. Or we also understand that the reason why the virtues are what they are, or the reason we aspire to that, is because God set out the world in a certain order. So we're aspiring to follow that, we're aspiring to mimic that, and we want to follow the laws of God. So it's a slightly different twist, obviously, but natural virtue is still present within religion and within Christianity, but that's a topic for another time. So virtue, all throughout the ancient world and throughout the Christian world, right up to the Reformation and the Enlightenment, which I'm about to speak about, there were kind of two aspects to it. The first was self-mastery. So even in ancient Rome, you'll read these texts, you'll read Livy, for example, and they talked about how the fall of the Roman Empire was caused by men who indulged their lust and their greed, and they became vicious. They could no longer act for the best interest of the people. So there's a heavy emphasis on virtue and being that self-regulation, where I'm actually able to control all my base and animal desires and actually function as a proper member of society. So there's that self-mastery. And obviously, in terms of the Christian picture, that's super important, because we know that a lot of these desires that are within us, they can easily become disordered and lead us into sin. So there's a huge aspect of natural virtue, which is really important for us to cultivate in order to be able to actually direct ourselves to live a holy life and focus on God and focus on godly things. Because if we don't actually make any of those efforts, you're going to default to the lowest common factor or the lowest common denominator, which is what majority of people are doing. You know, they're living day to day. They're living based off their dopamine. They're not living due to their rational thinking or because they see a good and they want to work towards it. Like, that's a foreign concept now. So it was self-mastery and service. So they're basically both very intertwined, but I'm virtuous insofar as I'm able to serve others as well. The reason I'm disciplined, or the reason that I'm courageous, or the reason that I'm chaste is in order to serve my family, my wife, my community, my kingdom. They're all things that are outward focused. So yeah, they're beneficial to me internally because that's the best way to live and that's what's going to get me to heaven. But me being virtuous is also conducive to other people's flourishing and to the support of society. So there's a double meaning here. Like, you can justify being virtuous just because it does do good to others. But as Stoicism identified, and as we know from our own sort of personal relationship with God, it's obviously really important for us to be virtuous too. So there's two levels of that. So self-mastery and service, and self-denial. So what I'm trying to illustrate, what I've been trying to illustrate in the past 11 minutes, is that this was the status quo. No one questioned this. Like, we look at those stereotypes of the people that we would like to imitate from the past. It's the Spartan soldier who had that discipline, you know, who had that iron will, who was able to stand, you know, the 300 at the Pass of Thermopylae. Or we have the knights from the medieval age, you know, these awesome, cool guys who rode horses and, you know, fought with swords and were the pinnacles of discipline and chivalry. It was very virtue based, and I think that's the reason why we admire and respect them, because we see these guys who have devoted their lives to, I guess, serving their kingdom or serving the church in this way, and it's almost like a monastic thing. Like, they've chosen to live by these principles, and that's why it's a stereotype across time. You know, we have the knight who slays the dragon. Like, it's operating at so many levels here, but that's always someone who we valued, even just as a kid. Like the guy who rescues the princess, the guy who defeats the dragon, the guy who acts virtuously and chooses the path of suffering and then wins. Like that's obviously Christ, the ultimate archetype. So what happened? So you have virtue concerning self-mastery, and I wrote here, despite the flesh, or despite the desires of my own will. So it's that knowledge of the good and the ability to act due to the good, not to do what's down here, coming up, drawing me down. And now what's the parallel that we have today? So it's kind of an inverted self-mastery, because what do they say? They say, my body, my choice, or I can identify as what I want, or everyone has a voice, or it's all of these slogans that are very individually focused. And it's focused completely wrong, because it's self-mastery in the sense that I'm determining my own destiny. So, but instead of despite my own flesh or despite my own will, it's self-mastery or self-indulgence of my flesh, of my own will. So I act according to what I want and what I feel, and reality and what other people need or say doesn't actually matter. So you have that shift in mindset, and now we see a million different problems that have arisen from this. I want to have sex without the consequences, contraception and abortion. I want to indulge my own will. I want to have and do the marital act outside of relationships, and now we're obstructing the natural end of sex. We're removing the need for marriage, and we're also slaughtering babies by the millions. Okay, cool. What's next? Transgenderism. I decide I'm a woman, therefore I'm going to ignore biology, put all of these strange chemicals into my body, dress up like the other gender or the other weird stuff that they do. So it's this self-will, but it's completely wrong. It's completely perverted. Because not only does it not serve wider society, in fact, it's very damaging, but it's also not what we are made to do. It's completely against the natural end. The natural end of a man and woman, for example, obviously we have our vocations to work and grow and provide and all of the stuff that's not even involved with marriage. Then we have the end of marriage, which is to come together in the sacrament and to raise a family. But now, because of this hyper focus on the individual, this weird twist on virtue, it's all of a sudden what I want, what I need, what I think, I, and the things are crumbling. Like the family's absent fathers, like there's so many problems that have arisen from this discarding of virtue. And now I'm entertaining every single desire. I'm indulging the flesh every single day. Like there's this, either we're not following the virtue anymore, or we've completely perverted what virtue is. And this brings me back to the video which I posted the other day, which is what happened in the Enlightenment, which I guess this stuff has been happening slowly. It's not like it just happened one day and someone flicked a switch, but how the older classical virtues have been discarded or replaced for those virtues that are centered on the individual. So let me read from this book here. The second part of this revolution comprised a re-evaluation of the very nature of virtue. The older classical virtues associated with personal honor, courage, self-control, and unflagging independence and integrity were undoubtedly admirable. So the author here and society at the time is coping by saying, we admire that and we respect that, but, as Hume noted, were too violent and too unnatural for a modern and refined age. So whether or not these people were already struggling to be virtuous, instead of doubling down on it and saying, I need to try harder, or what most people do, work harder, they're basically saying it's not for me, or it's not right anymore. And we see this in modern society as well. Oh, I need to try on my partner first, or I need to sleep with people, or it's okay to have sex before marriage, or we can wait a bit before settling down. I don't know, it's okay to be fat, for example. It's okay to be gluttonous. Since when was that okay? They're taking taxpayer money to pay your blinking medical bills, unable to provide or defend your family as a father, or not being able to be present because you've got this huge burden. I was not intending to make a pun, but you've got this now physical ailment which you could in theory control, but you're not. Or lust, or alcohol addiction, all of these things. To be virtuous is too violent and too unnatural. Adam Smith contrasted these older virtues to the softer and more amiable modern virtues of candid condescension and indulgent humanity. So we can replace candid condescension to like tolerance, where it's this thing of like when a secular person sees someone religious, or a religious person sees someone secular, where we have this virtue of tolerance, where we're not actually meant to say what we think, or we're meant to tiptoe really lightly about the sensitive topics, because if we say what we think is right, or if we speak the truth, people are going to be offended and whatnot. And obviously there's a need for charity throughout all of this, but it's this softness, it's this tepidity. It's like the water's warm now. Instead of these ideals, these hot, fiery ideals which we held up, or that cold steel of discipline and virtue which the Western society was built off of, it's now tepid. The water's warm. There's no right or wrong. Indulgent humanity. We just live according to our desires and to what's pleasurable to us and to what I think is right. Like, do we see how much of a swing that is, and then how much damage it causes? Because it's like people don't even know what's virtuous anymore. They don't know how to act right. Like, they're going to default to the most basic. And because it's been so lost societally, I mean, I feel like we're just adrift. The older classical and Christian virtues were austere and impressive, but the modern ones were more tender-hearted and far more conducive to human happiness, plenty, and power. And I think that's ultimately the second problem here, which is not only are they wrong about everything, but they seem to think that these modern virtues, or this modern lack of virtue, is more conducive to human happiness, which I don't think that's not the case at all. And I think that's where I want to bring it back to Aristotle and Plato, is that when they were thinking and having these discussions, they realized that, well, hold on, eudaimonia, or true human flourishing, is not at the level of our base pleasures, is not at the level of these worldly goods. There's actually something higher here, and sometimes those things are going to clash. That doesn't mean that we default to what's easiest or what feels the nicest or to what's most pleasurable to us as humans. No one thought that, or they shouldn't think that. And society did not think that. You read about the Greek states, you read about Rome. That's not how they thought or acted. And if they did act like that, it was a perversion, or it was someone who was a reject, or was not being conducive to society. But now, that's the status quo, and we think that it is conducive to human happiness, and it's not. They've changed now. The truly desirable end is human happiness, rather than a virtuous character or a great soul. And I don't think anything really more has to be said on the subject, that the focus of virtue and the focus of all the efforts of an individual have now been turned inwards, and that's come at the detriment of our happiness, it's come at the detriment of our fulfillment, and it's come at the detriment of society. And we see that now, and we see that with all the social problems that are happening, the broken families, the addictions, all of these things, because virtue has been perverted or made weird, and it's now unnatural for modern man. So hopefully you agree with me. If you disagree with me, I hope that this has helped a little bit to broaden that picture. And again, I'm not saying it's easy. No one ever said it's easy, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth striving for these ideals. Like, what else are you gonna do? Like, you've got to become the knight and slay the dragon. There's nothing more to it. All right, guys, if you made it to the end, let me know in the comments, because it has been a bit of a long one. But jumbled thoughts. There wasn't really much on my notebook, just the general structure. I mean, this stuff is all coming off the fly, off the bat, or off things that I've read. So anyway, I won't bore you any longer. We'll see you next week. God bless.